Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Geographic Society, where our explorations tonight concern the world as it will be in the year 2050. Real generosity towards the future resides in dedicating everything to what happens now. Right now, I'm in the same position as all of you. I haven't seen these presentations, but I have it on good authority. They'll be powerful, urgent, not at all boring, immediate, and therefore really generous. What is especially generous is the fact that they've strictly timed their talks. This is not a debate. We have 4 experts giving us their view of the shape of things to come 4 decades from now. The first presentation will last 20 minutes. The next 3 talks will last 15 minutes each and no longer. It's very dangerous to make predictions. I think all of our speakers deserve medals for bravery. We can all think of the weatherman who told old ladies not to be silly, there's no chance of a hurricane. We all know of the army officer who said, don't be ridiculous, they couldn't hit an elephant at this dist. My brother-in-law is very grumpy about those experts of the 1960s who told us that after the year 2000, we'd all be living lives of extravagant luxury, and we'd all be blessed with easy wealth. You'll all have heard that there are many people who believe that the collider is going to create a black hole and destroy the planet. We all remember the millennium bug, and there are many people who believe that the world will end in the year 2012, during the Olympics, I hope before the finals of the synchronized swimming. It's very, very heartening to know that these 4 great people, and they're really, I've only just met them, and they are pretty wild, they believe that there is going to be a world in 2050. That's heartening indeed. We have this evening, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ian Golden, Professor Sarah Harper, Professor Julian Savulescu, and Dr. Malcolm D. McCulloch. So as he walks over to the lectern, let me briefly introduce Dr. Ian Golden. If anyone has any doubt about his prescience, please note that he was a banker up until a few years ago. He assures me that he ran a bank and did so successfully. He was, of course, Chief Executive and Managing Director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. He was an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. He worked at the World Bank, where he became Vice President in 2003. He is currently Director of the James Martin 21st Century School and Professorial Fellow at Balliol College. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Golden.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted that IQ2 wanted to create a discussion regarding the future. And it's also a pleasure to be in the Royal Geographic Society, which has always been a place of discovery and voyages unknown. The future is certainly unknown. In all areas, predictions will no doubt be wrong. This is true in technology, it's certainly true in politics, and it's certainly true in other areas. And it's not because the people who make these predictions, or the intelligence agencies, the giant corporations, aren't the best there is. These people are amongst the smartest, and the institutions are amongst the most powerful and most knowledgeable. And so we have to ask ourselves, is why do we always get the future wrong? And how do we begin to think about the future in a way that's more constructive? We will all spend the rest of our lives there. I hope many of us will reach the year 2050 and be able to think back on this evening and wonder to what extent we might have been wrong. So I'm going to try with my colleagues to tease out some of the big picture issues that we need to think about. And one of the most important elements in this is how rapidly the world is changing. This is a mapping of economic growth and population growth, and for those of you that understand exponentials, you'll see that that is an exponential growth rate. And the extraordinary thing about our lives has been that this is a period unknown in the history of humanity. We live in the most wonderful period, a period when more people have escaped poverty than ever before, where illiteracy has been halved, where life expectancy has gone up by about 20 years, and it took about 1,000 years to achieve that before. And on virtually any human development indicator you look at, I would challenge you to say that things have not been extraordinary. And so when we take a long view of this period, we have to ask ourselves, was that a particular accident and period in history, or is it sustainable? Will this continue? There was a period about 1,000 years ago where income growth and life expectancy and many other measures exceeded population growth. And that was also a period, like this period we've experienced, of incredible coming together of humanity, of the opening up of ideas, of Islamic and Christian civilizations coming together, of migrants moving across the planet, and of an explosion of innovation that came with that. And that has been the characteristic of the most recent period of globalization. Borders have fallen, the Berlin Wall came down, dictatorships were removed in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. Technologies facilitated all sorts of new things happening. China opened up, and economies opened up. And with that, not least because of fiber optics and the internet, ideas flourished. And that is why we've had this progress. But the underbelly of this is growing inequality and growing vulnerability. Our very interdependence, which has been the secret of our huge innovation and renaissance of the last 30 years, is possibly also our undoing. And so the big challenge for us and what we're trying to get our heads around and work on in the 21st Century School at Oxford is how do we ensure that we maximize the upside, that we sustain this in a way that will be good for the planet and good for us, and how we mitigate the big systemic risks. And the financial crisis is, of course, the first obvious manifestation of the 21st century crises, where the very things that created the wealth brought us down, the interdependence and the dependency on new technologies. Now, looking forward, and we'll come back to some of these as we discuss aging, what's startling is when we begin to look at the demographic projections out to 2050, even these things, which we used to regard as rather stable sorts of projections, have a range of about 4 billion people. We don't know whether they're going to be close to 8 or close to 12 billion people in the planet by 2050, only about 40 years from here. And that's, of course, of great importance for climate change and for many other things. And that's because we don't understand some of the key drivers behind this, particularly fertility, as Sarah will illustrate. The good news is that while you sit here, even if you think this evening is totally wasted, your life expectancy will increase by about 5 minutes. And so you can go home both physically and mentally, hopefully, fulfilled. But we're converging around about 2 years per decade improvement in life expectancy. The whole world is enjoying this. And there's one region, which is Southern Africa, where it's gone in the opposite direction due to HIV/AIDS. But this is a global story of success, and I would argue it's likely to be even more rapid in the future for the reasons that we'll come back to. Now, the biggest uncertainty is fertility, and the dramatic story here going forward is the very, very sharp decline in the number of babies that people are having. And so the world is converging below replacement levels, many parts of the world at around 1, and this, of course, is the uncertainty. But when women get work, when they get urbanized, and when they have a career, the fertility drops dramatically. And so we have many societies, as Sarah will illustrate, where what we used to think about as the dynamic of population pyramids is moving over this period that we're thinking about to a much more dangerous structure, an inverted, some would call a coffin shape, the aesthetic amongst you might say a vase, but a structure in which the huge dependency ratios will be a major burden on the youth. And of course, we have to ask who will push us around in our old age. And Sarah will come back to some of these questions. This is not simply a rich country phenomena. This is something which is happening around the world and is likely to be, in fact, a more significant driver in the Asian countries. So this massive change, we ask ourselves whether migration would be able to make up some of these deficits, and the simple answer is it's unlikely to, not only because it's not clear where the migrants will come from, given that those countries are going through even more rapid demographic change, but also because the numbers involved as the rich countries' labor force declines from about 800 million to 600 million, are much greater than migration scales that we can imagine currently. So this is likely to be a very important part of the solution. I would argue that migration is also a key dynamic of growth and innovation, but it's not going to really help us overcome our major structural changes. Underpinning globalization and underpinning the huge technological changes is this leapfrogging in the capacity of microprocessors and computing. And Moore, who in the 1960s predicted that the computing power will double about every 18 months, has seen this manifested over a much longer period than he predicted. And so we have the amazing phenomenon that all of our mobile phones are more powerful than the entire computing program of the first spacecraft, and why our kids' PlayStation 3s are more powerful than Deep Blue, the most powerful computer in the world 10 years ago. That was challenged with Kasparov. So this is where we go, and what happens is the potential that underpins this for doing things in new ways and for connecting each other in new ways is absolutely enormous and difficult to imagine. So this, again, is an exponential scale. It illustrates what the amount of information on the web. And what this is moving to is where we are already in the situation in which every year more information is being put onto the web than in the entire history of all words ever written and said in the history of mankind. And that's very rapidly moving to the space where in about 2012, it'll be every 2 days. More information will be put on the web than ever before, and then you move to 2 minutes about 4 years later. So this is the most extraordinary progression, and of course what this also shows, as the top blue line indicates, is that the capacity of the system technologically to cope with this seems to be there because of this growth in microprocessing power. Of course, the systemic risk underlying this is the fragility of the system and our dependence on it, and we'll come back to this. It's also allowing a whole set of amazing things to happen in medicine. This is nanoscale. This is a billionth of a meter, invisible to the eye. These are nanoneedles we're developing in Oxford, going through a cell membrane, and of course the ability to develop machines that live inside our bodies, that drive drugs and other things to different parts of the body, and Julian will touch on some of the implications of this, is enormous. But we don't really understand these things, and so this is a nanoneedle going through a cell. You see it takes a bit with it. You have to be careful. As these new technologies come on, as is often the case, and we clearly saw this in the case of the financial crisis, the power of the technology to drive the system ahead of the institutional regulatory capacity is enormous. So unless we understand the technologies, develop the regulatory tools, we become very vulnerable to them. And this, again, is a big issue as we go forward in medicine. This is a stem cell we've developed in Oxford from an embryonic cell. That's a cardiac cell directed from a stem cell. And we can begin to direct this towards any part of the body to be recreated. And so as you play this forward and you think about the implications for neural, for all sorts of different degenerative diseases, the potential to recreate any part of the body through this and also through genetics, which Julian will touch on, is absolutely enormous. And we can imagine the enormous benefits this will bring to all our loved ones who suffer from various degenerative diseases. But the key question as we drive these technologies forward and their immense power is, what will they do for us? Are these new risks associated with them? Will they be available to everyone? Will they enhance global inequalities? Will they provide us with the liberation we're seeking from many of our diseases? Or will they, in fact, lead to a much more difficult, unequal, and structurally unequal world? And Julian will come back to many of these questions. As we think forward about the risks, increasingly the risks will not be those that come from nature, but those that we have created ourselves, the anthropogenic risks. And the biggest, of course, that we're aware of is climate change. And we're rather pessimistic on this. We have scientists working on oceans, on tropical forests, and many other areas. And what we're trying to understand is what's happening, what might the tipping points be, but also what may we do about it. So geoengineering solutions, and Malcolm McCullough, who's working on carbon reduction, will illustrate some of the work that we're doing as we begin to think about technologies of the future which may address some of these challenges. As we move in the UK from about 10 tons per capita, and we have to get below 2 tons per capita. This is a structural shift in everything we do and the way we are that is required. It's a behavior change as well as a technological change that is desperately urgent if we are not to see an average warming of well over 4 degrees. And averages, of course, mask huge inequalities. There will be parts of the world that are literally uninhabitable. Another key issue as we go forward is pandemics. Again, the result of this interdependence of globalization is proximity, it's travel, it's transmission, and of course the pandemics, which have always been the greatest killers of mankind, will pose in the future also the greatest threat. And we've seen with the swine flu how within 1 month, 100 countries picked up this H1N1 from Mexico. We're very fortunate, touch wood, that so far this hasn't proved the killer we feared, but it will come. And so we're working very actively on what the strategies need to be, what drugs will work, how we distribute them, how you isolate the pandemics at source, and how you begin to mitigate this enormous and growing risk. And the risk increasingly is not only from natural pandemics, but from man-made ones. So the ability of evil minds to create new strains of smallpox or to create new pathogens that will destroy us all is growing every day. And for very little money, increasingly with information on the web and a clean room, one can do things which are extraordinarily bad for humanity. So what does one do about it? What does it mean for civil liberties? How do you begin to get a handle on these sorts of threats? The problem is that so many of these threats are interconnected. We are trying to understand where the tipping points are and where the weak spots are. And as we look at all these different dimensions of the future, all of which will influence in dramatic ways, we try and understand through interdisciplinary work how they connect and how we may enhance the outcomes through better understanding each dimension and the interconnection. A key question is who's going to think about this and who's going to be managing the world. One of the greatest risks is that we're stuck with a global governance system that is totally out of date. It was created in the ashes of the Second World War. It's a system which is not fit for 21st century purpose. And so a big and very difficult question for anyone that's worked in institutions as I have and been on the task forces which are set up to reform them is how do you move from where we are to where we need to be? And that is an absolutely key question. On that will, I think, depend many of the outcomes. So the questions of climate change and environmental pollution, of huge degradation of land and poverty, of financial crises, and of pandemics require a new way of thinking about the future. They require the coming together of the great wisdom and collective knowledge of humanity with the technologies which are coming on stream. And so the outcome is totally uncertain. We could have a future which is very good for some, but very dangerous for many, and which over the long term becomes increasingly unsustainable for the reasons I've illustrated. But we could also have a future which is unimaginably beautiful for all of us, where this incredible power that's been unleashed by our creativity is used for all our benefit. A future of what might be termed, in Jim Martin's words, eco-affluence, where we begin to do things in a way that doesn't harm the planet, that increases our well-being, an inclusive globalization which is shared by all. This is within our power. It's within our power to eradicate poverty by 2050. It's in our power to eradicate disease by 2050. But it's also in our power to destroy ourselves. And so it's absolutely critical that we build the knowledge, that we build an ability, and that we imagine a world where we can be happy and older and do the things we want to do in a way that is good for the planet and good for us. This is the future we need to embrace, it's the future we need to prepare for, and it's the future we need to ensure that we create by mitigating the very real downside risks. We work in a very wide range of areas in Oxford on these sorts of issues, and you're going to hear from my colleagues about just 3 of these dimensions. The ones regarding carbon from Malcolm McCullough, the ones regarding the bioethics from Julian Savulescu, and the ones regarding aging from Sarah Harper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Golden. You're not wrong. That's really provocative and interesting, and please hold your questions for later. Our next speaker is Dr. Malcolm D. McCullough. I'm told that he is an extroverted engineer. He doesn't look at his own shoes, he looks at yours. He also looks at other people's cars. He's an electrical engineer. He is director of the 21st Century Schools Institute for Carbon and Energy Reduction in Transport. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Malcolm D. McCulloch.
Thank you, Jack. That's where we live. And what you might notice is that the three last speakers, including myself, hail from that area down there. But one of the things that's very interesting to notice in this is you can see just how thin the atmosphere around the world is where we live, and that creates a vulnerability to which we have become susceptible. So I'm going to be looking at a brief glimpse out into 2050. I'll start off from the present day and saying what are the issues. I'll then present two scenarios going forward and then come back to say how do we go make certain changes to make sure that we head on the right scenario. So let's have a look and start off by saying what is the issue that's involved. Some of you may know that BP does one useful thing in the world, and that is that it collects all the energy that is actually being consumed in the world and aggregates it by not only in time but also by type of energy that's consumed and also by place. But the worrying thing to notice is that in the last 5 years or so, there's been a substantial increase in the amount of energy that we're actually producing and we're using in the world. This has primarily been driven by the China syndrome. One of the interesting things to note at the moment is that each person in the world is effectively generating 2.24 kilowatts per hour every hour. And that's effectively saying that each person in the world is boiling a kettle, having two lights on and an iPod charger on every time. Weird question to start off with, just to make you start thinking, is what went wrong at the Cliffs of Dover? The bad news is I'm not going to give you the answer now. You can think about it. This is some of the work that Ian pointed out as the IPCC future scenarios on how we're going to start producing emissions. And to me, the scariest figure of the whole lot is to have a look and say, what happens now? In 2008, we are on the worst case scenario. It's actually worse than the worst case scenario that was predicted a mere 5 or 6 years ago. So what we're saying at the moment is we're on a trajectory that's far worse than anything predicted 5 years ago. If you have a look at what the implications of some of those projections were, so if you look at the worst case scenario, by the end of 2100, we're looking at least at between a 4 and a 6 degree temperature rise. We are doing worse than that at the moment. And that, to me, is a scary number to be worried about. What are the impacts of that at the moment? And that is to say that as we get more energy into the system, we then have more extreme climate events. Those extreme climate events have direct financial impacts and have impacts in terms of additional deaths. On a more personal note, this is a picture, not of a river close to me, that's my son. This is not a river close to us, that is actually my road leaving my property. Okay, this is in 2007. We live in a floodplain. We deem to be a 1 in 50 year floodplain. It's flooded 4 times in the last 3 years. So we know that weather is changing. So what's going wrong? Some of the systemic problems that we have in our society, we have a disconnection between what are the true costs and the price that we pay for goods. So we don't account for the real impact of things like burning carbon in our normal everyday lives. The second issue is that we're addicted to once-through resource use. We have something that we dig out of the ground, we process it, we transport it, we sell it, we use it, we dump it. And that's the end of the problem. However, if you look at something like nature, things tend to work in cycles, and where somebody's waste product becomes somebody's nutrient. And that's something that we are going to have to change in the future. And the third issue that we have is that we have a growing population. And for my purposes, I'm going to assume that we're going to get to about 9 billion by 2050. So if you look at two future scenarios with those in account, let's have a look at scenario one, which I call the low road, where we're saying we have a decrease, no change in pricing mechanism. We continue to use fossil fuels and depleting our resources, and we have an average energy consumption which is only half of that of the USA at the moment. That implies that we would have a net increase of energy consumption by a factor of 3. So that means instead of having 2 bar heaters going, we now have 6 bar heaters going on typically. At the moment, the proven oil reserves allow us to have 42 years ahead. Increasing now our consumption rate by a factor of 3 means we only have about 14 years left. Even sitting now, you look to 2050, 42 years is looking worryingly close to the end of oil. Coal gives you a lot more to go for. At the moment, the current production, 120 years, but at 3 times the rate, it's down to 40 years. And gas, we got about 60 years, or at 3 times the rate, down to 20 years. So what does that imply? First of all, we'll be saying that if we continue the fossil fuel route, we'll be continuing a push to converting coal into a liquid so that we continue to power mainly our transportation infrastructure. We also find that electricity will be mainly be developed by coal-fired because there's not sufficient uranium at the moment to supply that large energy need. We also find that gas will start to be used primarily for production of plastic because it cannot use oil anymore. And what you'll find is that the impact on a personal level is that each person, the major cost will be the energy, and it will be increasing for each household year on year. What we then find is that when it gets to 2050, transport becomes extremely expensive, and long-distance travel will become, once again, the domain of the elite only. We also find that implications on food will start becoming expensive because the long transportation, the long distances that they need to travel makes it much more expensive. And also you'll find things like fertilizers will start becoming difficult to make, and so therefore there would have to be a push towards GMO. We'd also find that we'll go through a period in about 15 to 20 years' time where there'll be electrical blackouts, because, something similar to what happened to Detroit in 2003, and that's mainly because of the push on the time that it takes to produce new coal-fired stations. We'd also be definitely on a path towards a 6-degree temperature rise, which would mean that we'd be at a level where it would be difficult to see how civilization would live beyond 2100. We'd also find that other issues, not only energy, but things like water, resource scarcity, will also have a particular impact on our daily lives. So if you come back and think about what was that strange question, what went wrong on the cliffs of Dover? The main issue is this little guy here. To give you an idea, that's 1 micrometer, so he's about 5 micrometers across. And he's a type of algae called a Cochleotrophus, and he produced a calcium shell around him. And when he died, basically nothing would eat him. And so basically over hundreds of thousands of years, more and more of these will build up, and they actually produce the White Cliffs of Dover. So the chalk is actually the waste product of an organism that was not suited to producing cyclical waste. An organism this small can do so much damage to the environment. Imagine what we could be doing if we don't produce cycles. So if you look at a scenario 2, where we try and say, let's have a look at a more optimistic way, we say that we do start to include carbon dioxide into our costing regimes. We do recognize that resources are finite. We keep the same assumption on population, and we say that actually well-being is more important than accruing products. What happens there is that instead of having a factor 3, we still have a factor 2 increase in the amount of energy. So we still have a sufficiently large amount of increase in the amount of energy. But we'd have to look at other resources. And something that's worthwhile noting is that the Earth at the moment captures enough energy, which is 5,500 times more energy than we would need at that point. Okay, so in 2050, the Earth is still capturing 5,500 times more energy than we need, and therefore we'd have to look at ways of harnessing it. Something just to remind you is that both wind, hydro, and wave are all products of solar energy. So all of those come behind that. The other options that we would have are using the moon, and basically that drives the tides, and also nuclear fusion would be options that we'd be looking at. So the type of implications that this leads is that we'd be looking to large-scale renewables, both on a very large scale and at a domestic level. One of the big issues we're going to be is how do we deal with the diurnal processes, and so how do we deal with energy storage? That's going to be one of the key issues in the future. What you'll find is that energy will start be using a lot more smartly, and that consumers are going to become far more conscious of exactly how much and when they're using their energy. And one of the key changes in the business sense is that instead of having products, we'll move much more towards a service-based industry, and to help us reduce the amount of cost for delivering a particular service rather than energy. So if we have a look at saying, what are the legacy going to be? First of all, we're going to be moving to services, and particularly in transport, we'll find that mobility will be tailored to the particular tasks in hand. We're not going to be using single-use vehicles, but rather multiple vehicles that are going to be each tailored to their specific uses. We're going to have electricity tariffs which are going to be dynamic and going to match the demand and supply that we have, and we're going to have devices which respond to that. Even on the optimistic scenario, I would say we're probably onto a 3-degree temperature rise. 2 degrees, I think we passed that. I think we're going to still have a 3-degree temperature rise. Other issues that you'll find is that certain affluent societies will no longer have the lifestyle that they used to, but that there'll be more of a parity across what populations can have. If we drill down in something and look at, say, something about what are the implications in transport, is because we have the growing population, richer population, and larger commuting distances, it means that by now we need at least a factor 15 decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide per kilometre travelled. Now, engineers are used to dealing with a decrease of 15%, not 96%, and that's going to be a real challenge. The good news is that we've already achieved a car that can do 5,500 miles per gallon, which comes to about 1.3 grams of carbon per kilometre, factor of 100 down. But the problem is there's an 11-year-old and there are his knees. Okay, so it's quite a challenge for that to be a general vehicle, but it does show what the boundaries of possibility are. One of the things we've been involved in, particularly in our group, is developing new types of electric motors to go into new types of cars. And this is the Morgan Life car, which is a hydrogen-based sports car, which does around about, has a range of 350 kilometers, does 0 to 100 kilometers or 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds, and does 49 grams of CO2 per kilometer, which is about half of what the best commercial vehicles at the moment are doing. So that's some of the work that we're busy working on. We're also working in some of the other vehicles, a commercial vehicle and an urban hydrogen vehicle, and we can show that life is that we can actually start to achieve that factor 15. In terms of making the energy consumers much more aware, one of the things that we're looking at doing is getting it to the point where we can actually help consumers identify where their energy is actually going so that they can help minimize it. So we've been developing a product which is effectively an ultra-smart meter, which can start to tell you where your energy is going in your home so you can start to understand where you're actually losing it. I've been part of a trial, and it's amazing how much energy is going into our security lighting and our shower, which I hadn't appreciated. The rabbits outside keep on turning it on at 3 o'clock in the morning. So one of the things that we're doing is we'll be going to a high-value, enabling high-valued energy services which will connect into the smart grid. Third area that we're doing some work on is looking at tidal generation and looking at new devices, which allows to scale so that we can start to get a significantly larger devices on the order of 100 megawatts, rather than something like the 3 megawatt device that you'd have in turbines. And to give you an idea of the size that they will be, that there will be about a 20-meter diameter, and this will be several hundred meters in length, and those will enable one to produce something like 100 megawatts. So hopefully that's given you a quick tour of where we think the future is and where some of the directions are going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm D. McDonough. Dr. Malcolm D. McCulloch. Wow. How sweet the word optimistic can be. Our third speaker is Professor Julian Savulescu. He has presented at conferences across the world. He's made numerous appearances on TV. He's a regular on Andrew Denton's Enough Rope, which is a huge hit on ABC in Australia. He holds a chair in practical ethics at the University of Oxford. He doesn't want to talk about impractical ethics. And he is director of the 21st Century Schools program on ethics at the new Biosciences at the 21st Century School. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Julian Savulescu.
Thanks very much, Jack. The sequencing of the human genome, personalised genomes, cloning, stem cells, and Craig Venter's search to create purely artificial life. We are today a part of a very early but radical biological revolution that will dwarf the Industrial Revolution. The world in 2050 could go one of two ways. It could be a world of the second human enlightenment, where the enlightenment will be of the human condition and the human animal and the possibility of radically improving that animal. Or it could be a second dark ages from which we may never exit. We have the possibility today to radically change the human condition. Of course, throughout human history, we've been very concerned to improve ourselves. Coffee is the world's second largest export. It's the export of a drug, caffeine. We've developed cosmetic surgery and body art through the ages in an attempt to achieve our various aesthetic or religious goals. Sugar on the top left is a very effective enhancer. But more recently, we've developed drugs like Adderall and Ritalin that college students and academics use to improve cognitive performance. modafinil, which is worth over $1 billion in the US, largely through access through the internet. American pilots use it in Iraq. Viagra, deep brain stimulation, and we may well even develop new sensors, such as the ability to sense magnetic fields. This is the current list of effective cognitive enhancers, but once we develop drugs which are effective for diseases like Alzheimer's disease, these drugs will improve human performance in the near future. But by 2050, we will see much more radical biological modification. And for those of you who are sceptical, walk down the park to see the power of genetics and biology. Because the 300 or so different breeds of dogs that you can see on a casual visit are very different. Some are big, some are small, some are stupid, some are smart, some are vicious, some are placid, some are hardworking, some are lazy. This is all genetic as a result of a very crude selective breeding experiment run over 10,000 years, where all of those different breeds of dogs were selected from a small group of canids and wolves. But our power today is not just in terms of selective breeding. We have the capacity to fundamentally change biology. On the left-hand side is a rabbit that glows in the dark, a fluorescent rabbit which was alive and well until recently, and I think it died of old age. It was created by French scientists by introducing a gene from a jellyfish into the rabbit a number of years ago. It shows that we can effectively transfer genes from one species to another safely today. On the right-hand side is an embryo which fluoresces. That's actually a human embryo created last year using exactly the same technology. It was destroyed, but if it grew up, we have every reason to believe it would fluoresce as a human being, just as that rabbit does. So any gene that's present in the plant or animal kingdom is ours potentially to have. We could have the vision of a hawk, the hearing of a dog, the sonar of a bat. Now, just in case you're again sceptical, here is another one of my favourites. Here is a genetically modified mouse. On the front is the modified mouse called super mouse, and the back is a normal mouse. And they're running at 20 metres per minute. Now, super mouse, you'll see occasionally falls off the treadmill initially, but gets back. There he goes, falling off. He gets back on. But after 200 metres, the normal mouse collapses from exhaustion. Now, super mouse keeps going and going for something like 5 hours. Sorry, 6 hours. And he runs 5 kilometres, whereas the normal mouse ran only 200 metres. Super mouse ate 60% more, he lived much longer, looked much healthier, and reproduced to the equivalent of the age of 80 years in human terms. We have exactly the same, or nearly exactly the same glucose cycle. We could modify human beings today to create what nature would never have naturally created, superhumans. Of course, this mouse requires twice as much food, but many of us have twice as many calories as we should have. How should we harness this power? This is not nuclear power, this is the power of biology, the power of knowledge. We've already achieved the largest brains that humans can have and be delivered through natural childbirth, but our understanding of early brain development, the use of nerve growth factors, the targeting of our knowledge of neuroscience could well help us to augment significantly brain mass and development early in life, as could nanotechnology. Scientists in the UK and China have already begun to use rabbit eggs and fusing them with human genetic material to create stem cells, hopefully for the production of organs and the development of regenerative medicine. The same technology could also be used to create chimeras or hybrid life forms. They have already largely reconstituted the brains of rats and mice with human stem cells to create hybrid life forms. This power is significant. This is a leopon. It's a cross between a leopard and a lion, created by selective breeding, by crossbreeding. This is a liger, cross between a lion and a tiger. This is created by mixing the sperm and the eggs of different animals. But this is a geep, created by fusing a goat and a sheep embryo using technology that's over 15 years old. Very simple to do. What was science fiction in the 60s is possible today. With $6 million US, we could create a live-born human chimp chimera. Human ageing, Sarah will speak a lot about the potential problems that our current levels of longevity are creating, but this may be the tip of the iceberg. Humans, through most of human history, lived to about the age of 20 or to the mid-20s. they didn't develop genetic mechanisms to prevent ageing because there was no selection pressure, as there was with turtles, which had a hard shell and were resistant to injury and early death. But with our understanding of the fundamental ageing process, we may well be able, through the use of regenerative medicine, or by directly intervening in ageing, to prolong human life beyond the current maximum of 120. Some people have even said that indefinite extension of human life is a possibility. Even human unhappiness has been shown to have significant biological determinants. How subjectively happy you feel, what hedonic tone, how you tend to feel, is largely dependent not on your circumstances, but on your biology, and we will be able to understand that and intervene. How will this radical power be used? Well, biology has no mind to fairness or equality. Every characteristic is distributed across people differently. Some I can't see you very well, but I'm sure some of you are tall, some of you are short, some of you are bald, some of you are hairy. That's largely biological. This is a curve for intelligence. We define arbitrarily intellectual disability as an intelligence, an IQ score of less than 70. That's a statistical definition. Somebody with 75 is said to be normal. But this intelligence, this IQ score, is highly correlated with many personal and social opportunities. The US military, even from the Second World War, started testing people's IQ because it realised that below 85, even normal people were poorly trained as foot soldiers. Today, you require an IQ of 95 to actually be admitted into the US military to be a soldier. You require an IQ of 90 to complete a tax return in the US. About 20% of people, normal people, not people with intellectual disability, lack the IQ to complete a tax return. This is profoundly disabling in a way that can frustrate people's life opportunities, choice of career, and even vulnerability to accident. Intervention in this inequality can be very cheap. 1 in 3 people around the world don't get enough iodine. If you're pregnant and you don't get enough iodine, your baby loses about 10 to 15 IQ points. It may still be normal, but it will have lost some of its potential. This means that around 1 billion IQ points are lost around the world each year. This is a huge loss of mental capital and mental potential, human potential. However, it only costs 2 to 3 cents per person per year to iodise salt, which would significantly promote the well-being of those people affected. Other interventions may also be cheap. Choline is a substance which occurs naturally in eggs. It's like a vitamin. It's been shown in some studies to increase the IQ of fetuses during pregnancy. Modafinil, I mentioned before, is a drug which was developed for sleep disorder. It improves wakefulness, working memory, and executive cognitive function. It costs about $100 to $200 per month to take, the same as smoking 2 packets of cigarettes per day. Not only may intervening in our natural state have personal benefits, it may have significant social and economic benefits. Studies have estimated that a mere 3-point increase in IQ would reduce the poverty rate by 25% and welfare recipiency by about 20%. That's because of the severe effect of the tail of the curve. It would add about 1.5% to GDP and about $160 billion to the US economy annually. What we did with computing and information technology externally, these are simply forms of cognitive enhancement, will be possible internally by 2050. That's why the US military is investing significantly in enhancing the human condition. This is one statement from DARPA. The world contains approximately 4.2 billion people over the age of 20. Even a small enhancement of cognitive capacity in these individuals would probably have an impact on the world economy rivaling that of the internet. Of course, Ian mentioned this could create gross inequality. We haven't seen that with computing and mobile phones, but we may see the division of society into the enhanced and the unenhanced. We may see an increase in poverty. But there are even darker sides to the biological revolution, and Ian mentioned briefly some of these. This is a mouse afflicted with mousepox, and about 6 or 7 years ago, scientists in my home of Australia, with very cheap technology, modified mousepox in an attempt to create a strain which rendered mice infertile that was super lethal. And they published this on the internet. It was immediately apparent that you could do exactly the same thing with human smallpox and create a super lethal strain that would wipe out large numbers, if not the whole of humanity. That is a polio virus which was artificially created by ordering subunits across the internet. What was in the hands of only a handful of people in the 50s and 60s, that is nuclear technology, is probably in the hands of tens of thousands of people today and will rapidly be in the hands of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. The answer will also, at least in part, lie in our biology. The capacity for humans to cooperate and to engage in moral behaviour has a significant biological determination. We now have identified a mutation on the X chromosome that, when present in conjunction with early social deprivation, is highly predictive of criminal behaviour. We have administered biological interventions to change human behaviour. Paedophiles in California are offered castration with estrogen to reduce their sex drive as an alternative to imprisonment. We're starting to begin to understand the biological bases of disorders like autism and psychopathic personality disorder, and we've already identified substances which change people's willingness to cooperate. Oxytocin promotes trust. Serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac can increase human cooperation and reduce aggression. Many of the world's problems require human cooperation. Humans are biologically essentially the same as Pleistocene man several hundred thousand years, 200,000 years ago. And that was a human being designed to be altruistic to its kin and a small group of about 150 people. Humans have limited ability to cooperate, limited altruism. They will tend to free ride when they're in larger groups, where their contributions are not seen, and when there are multiple people contributing. The capacity to solve problems like the global climate problem requires humans to cooperate in ways which they are not disposed to cooperate. In order to make progress in this, we need to understand our own evolutionary limitations. Even love and sexual behaviour may come under the glass and influence of science. This is a species of vole. The meadow vole is characteristically polygamous. The prairie vole is characteristically monogamous. You can render meadow voles monogamous by genetic engineering. We've now identified the same mutation that those, or the same genetic change that those voles have in human beings. And men with two copies of one particular variant, similar to that of the polygamous vole, experience much higher rates of marital crisis, threats of divorce in the last year. Their partners are much less happy with them, and they have much less consensus and harmony in the relationship. So even your capacity to sustain a monogamous long-term relationship may have some biological basis. We share with all other animals 3 phases to our love and human relationships: lust, attraction, and attachment. All of these have different biological bases, and you can simulate them or promote them by the administration of these kinds of substances. As I mentioned, oxytocin promotes pair bonding. Indeed, testosterone has been given to increase sex drive in women and estrogen to reduce it in men. The capacity of women to experience orgasm is apparently largely genetically determined. So 2050 offers us a choice. A world of liberation from the evolutionary constraints that our biology places upon us, the differences between individuals, the capacity to realise greater social and economic productivity, increased happiness and well-being. But it also raises the spectre of a world which may, if it exists at all, be one of gross inequality, incarceration at the most fundamental level. So my hope is that we realise the root of bio-liberation, but the root of bio-threat remains large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Julian Savulescu, and especially thank you for showing once again that the future has an ancient heart. Our next speaker is Professor Sarah Harper. She started out with the BBC as a news and current affairs reporter. She worked as a producer. She's now a professor at Oxford University, and she directs the Oxford Institute of Aging. She's a member of the 21st Century School. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sarah Harper.
Predicting social futures is somewhat difficult, how our attitudes and cultures are going to change, don't have the luxury of the kind of frameworks that my colleagues who work in the more harder sciences have. But we do have one thing that we can draw upon, and these are the predictions that Ian talked about, which are demographic predictions. Demographically, I think it is highly likely that the world will have about 9 billion people by 2050, but a third of those will possibly, that's some 3 billion, be aged over 60. So I want to look at the world in 2050, starting at the demography as we understand it. If we map the percentage of the population who is going to be elderly or over 60 by the middle of the century, you can see from the red colouring that potentially the vast majority of the world will have at least 20% of its population aged over 60 by then. And indeed, the green, which is Europe and much of Asia, shows that in fact this part of the world will have at least a third of its population aged over 60. And the blue colours are those where at least a quarter of the population. But we have to look at the whole population dynamic. If we go back to look at these red countries, and we then convert this into those older societies and look at what their youth structure is going to be like, we can see that these are the parts of the world that are going to have declining young people. And this is the other side of population aging. Those countries that are aging dramatically are aging through a combination of increasing longevity and falling fertility. So by 2050, the mid-UN predictions, and our predictions have been consistently underestimating, suggest that only sub-Saharan Africa will still have over 20% of its population aged under 15. So we have parts of the world that currently have about 40% of its population under 15 that will end up with less than 20%. We've got very used to the kind of dynamic we have at the moment. This is a population pyramid, and you can see it's traditional, lots of young people being born, coming into our economies and societies, and driving them forward. By 2050, we will move, for most of the world, from the population pyramid into the skyscraper. And this means that roughly every floor of the skyscraper will have 10% of the population and 10% of the age range. So 10% will be aged between 0 to 10, 10, 20 to 30, so on. And this is a tremendous success if we can really get here by 2050, because it means that the majority of people who are born will live long, healthy, active lives. And we should get there if we can get over this, which Ian showed you is what we might call the V or the vase shape. This is Japan in just 20 years' time. But the majority of the world by 2050 will move through that into the skyscraper shape. So I'm going to pose 4 questions, 4 scenarios, and ask, these are unclear, but what is the most probability that we will enter into them? So, are we going to end up with it being the last century of youth? What about generational succession? Are we going to see 2050 as a time of morbidity? And will longevity be the new global inequality? I think without any doubt, the 21st century is indeed going to prove the last century of youth. Total fertility rate, that is the maximum, that is the number of children per reproductive woman, has consistently fallen. And as Ian said, in many parts of Asia, for example, it's now less than 1 per child, 1 per reproductive woman, 1 child per reproductive woman. And the impact that that is going to have at the societal and global level by 2050 is going to be significant. Just take global migration, for example. Much of the trends that we have at the moment are the rich old countries of the Northern Hemisphere sucking in young workers from the South. By 2050, the youth of the South will also have disappeared. And what we already have predictions that by 2030, the brain drain is going to go from the US over to China, as China sucks in the global skills. So we're going to have very, very different possibilities for skills in our economies. And the inevitable fact is that we're going to be living longer and we're going to be working longer. So what kind of workplaces will we have when we have the average age of our workers aged 50 and large numbers of the workforce aged between 50 and 70? What will our families be like? We're going to move, it is predicted, to the beanpole family, where we have 4 or 5 generations living together at the same time. Again, a tremendous success. if you can have those numbers of generations living together, working together, and being together in families. But it brings another issue, and that is the issue of generational succession. This is the story of increasing longevity, and I'm just going to talk about what we call incremental longevity. I'm going to come to the radical longevity that Julian was talking about in a minute. If we just look at Japan for the moment, they've just announced 40,000 centenarians in Japan this year. Now, it took 100 years to go from 100 centenarians to 10,000. It then took 7 years to go from 10 to 20. It took 4 years to go from 20 to 30. And they've gone from 30,000 centenarians to 40,000 centenarians in just 2 years. And that is the world that we'll be moving into over the next 40 years. And that brings in this whole question of generational succession. By 2050, we are going to be asking questions on longevity, which are going to be around, do we think it's a good idea that we should all be living to a century? Or should we be living to 120? Or should we be living to 150 or 200? Because that is the way potentially science is going to be driving us. But if you think in terms of generational succession, that most societies have a concept that you pass down wealth and status and power down through the generations. What happens when we don't inherit from our parents until we're 80, or from our grandparents until we're 80? I recently did a BBC phone-in, and a woman rang up and said, I'm in my 70s, my brothers are in their 80s, and our mother will not die. Now, that's a very sad story, but it actually shows those brothers will never be head of the household, she believed, or if they will be so old by the time they become head of the household. That is the world that we're moving into in 2050. What will happen to our workplaces? What's going to happen to youth coming into workplaces when we have people, 80, 100, living and active in our communities? But that is potentially the world of 2050. Will it be a time of morbidity? Will it be a time of frailty and disease? Without any doubt, one of the things that we will see by 2050 is probably the conquering of acute disease. And we will be moving into a world where we have chronic conditions. They may well be chronic conditions that we can live with, because the science and the biology and the medical advances will enable things to be replaced and drugs to keep us going. But if we are going to have a third of the world's population aged over 60, and we're going to have maybe 15% of the world's population aged over 80, or even more, undoubtedly it is going to be a world where chronic disease and living with chronic disease is going to be prevalent. And then finally, return to something that my colleagues have talked about. And this is about longevity, the new global inequality. Now, are we going to move into a world where we are going to have people in the US and China being able to enhance the kind of technologies that Julian has been talking about? Are we going to have a world where we are able to live to 150? But 150, is that going to be the natural lifespan of the population? Or is it going to be the maximum lifespan just for a few? And one of the issues are scenarios where we will indeed have long, long lifespans, but they will be concentrated in a certain part of the world. And we will still have, for example, men in Africa with life expectancies of only 50. And I think the new global inequality is potentially going to be the life opportunity that you have at birth. And I want us to sort of end by thinking about this particular slide, because here I think we have one of the biggest challenges in terms of our social future. And this is actually a picture of, on this side, my parents, who live in my village. They're in their 80s. They're incredibly active. They help me with my children. My mother has had lenses replaced. My father has had knees replaced. This is now. By 2050, the potential for replacing parts of the body, the drugs that they are taking are very simple drugs. Many of you in the audience may have them. It's highly likely, as Julian was suggesting, that we will have older people, and that these people will not be in their 80s, but they'll be looking like this, but they'll be 120. But at the other end, we have the life expectancy of this child in Africa, whose life expectancy is just a mere few months. And I think one of the really big challenges from a social point of view as we move to 2050 is, do we have the political and economic will to harness the wonderful advances in science and technology to ensure that the child in Africa in 2050 will have the same life chance and the same potential longevity as the people who are living in the Northern Hemisphere? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have 40 minutes, almost 1 year for 1 minute for every year until 2050. And I'm very keen to take questions from the floor. Remember, there will be the blog and forum opportunities on the respective websites. Hands, please. First, please.
My question is to the whole panel. In view of these rather amazing statistics, how does everybody feel about euthanasia?
Okay, so please prepare yourselves for answering that. Obviously, not all the members of the panel will have time to answer all the questions. Yes, please, Jeremy.
Yeah, I just fascinating. Looking at each of the individual forecasts separately is fascinating. But I just wonder whether Sarah Harper, Ian Golding, and Julian Strangelove have actually all managed to work out the implications of their different predictions. If it is the case, for example, that we are all going to be bio-liberated into, at least all us Europeans and Americans are going to be bio-liberated into a much longer age, then has Dr. Malcolm McCulloch worked out the implications that this has for energy and so forth? Have we worked out, does this alter all those graphs and all those rather optimistic predictions about only 9 billion? If we're all, unless Dr. Julian has got a program for eliminating the younger people, it does rather suggest that there's going to be an awful lot more people around to consume more energy and more resources. My own final question is, does Dr. Julian think that if we were all to benefit from the fluorescent gene, so that we all glowed in the dark, we might affect a very serious energy saving and save some...
And there are so many other benefits. Thank you very much. The third, yes.
I'm here personally, but professionally I work for Blue Peter, and I was wondering if any of the panel could ask, it's just an interesting question, if there were any, if you had a 6-year-old in the audience, what do you think a 6-year-old would have cause to be most excited about what the world might look like in 2050?
Actually, I thought we had a baby in the audience who had perfect timing. Folks, okay, we've had 3 questions. Can I just leave it to you, ladies and gentlemen, just to take them as they go? I'm sure you can sort it out, so please answer the first one first and in order. Go ahead.
Let me try and answer some of the broad questions. I think one thing that is clear is that inequality isn't only going to be a potential threat between, say, London and Africa. You can drive now from one part of London to another, and there's a 25-year difference in life expectancy. And that's true of all the big cities of the UK. So this is not only a global issue, it's about how we see our technologies and our abilities in our societies at home as well as globally. And that is the big challenge facing us all. How do we harness these opportunities? It's a very deep thing. And it's also obviously about public finance and corporate finance. Who's going to pay for it is key. Just in terms of the summing up question, yes, we are beginning to think about the implications of all of this. The school, 21st Century School, is a startup. We've been going on for 4 years, and a lot of this work is just coming off the conveyor belt now. So we're beginning to add up our things. We're beginning to debate intensely internally and look at the different implications. A lot depends on what we do. There's no deterministic future, and I hope that one message that you all come away with tonight is we can shape it. Collectively as mankind, this is about choice. This is about knowledge of what is potentially out there, and then do we act to determine one way or another. So there's no one adding up that's going to tell you that the carbon footprint's going to be something or age is going to be determined in one way. It's that these potentials exist and we need to harness the implications. So yeah, the other thing I would just take a little point of issue on, I don't think the challenge is going to be too many youth. I think we're going to actually be thinking in 2050 that we need more people, especially those of us that are going to need to be pushed around in our wheelchairs. So it's that assumption regarding demographics, once we conquer the carbon footprint and other issues, I think is going to be challenged by that time.
Right. Next, please.
Well, the question on euthanasia, I think, is a very important one. I think every civilised country in the world will fairly soon have liberal laws with respect to assisted suicide and euthanasia, and they will certainly be necessary in the future as people can live on much longer and indefinitely. It may well be that we start to see a kind of moral norm about taking responsibility for personal responsibility for how long you choose to live. But I have no doubt that euthanasia will, certainly by 2050, be legal in most civilised places in the world. The second question from the gentleman that referred to me as Dr. Strangelove. Of course, these things have implications. What their implications are going to be is very difficult to predict. I was asked to provide a provocative talk, which I tried to do. But the whole environment that situates these may radically change. So, for example, Craig Venter is attempting to create artificial life, organisms that have never existed in the world and never could naturally exist, that would, for example, metabolise carbon dioxide or provide new energy sources. Now, it's very difficult to predict in 50 years' time what these sorts of changes to the world will cause and what sort of world they will support. The very funny joke about us all fluorescing and saving energy, well, we could conceivably be able to create human beings with chlorophyll as a way of producing energy. So what seems to be fantastic and ridiculous may in fact become reality. So, I can't predict what the world will be like, but I think it will be very different to the way it is today.
Anyone? Go ahead, please.
So also just picking up on that, I'm not qualified to answer on the euthanasia, but on the changing demographics, I think one of the interesting things that we're going to experience in the next 20 years or so is the ageing and retiring workforce and the lack of people coming through. And that's going to put a severe dent in our capability to create the transformations that we need to do. And that's something that I know the energy industry is struggling with at the moment. And that's going to be a more significant, rather than the extra number of people that are going to be around. That's going to be a far more significant impact.
Okay, Sarah, you, I've got two people who've had hands up, so we need at least a third. Yes, you. Done. Great.
I want to talk about the question about population and environment, and I think the whole crux is going to be on consumption, because, of course, if you look, the people in the north are consuming so much more than the people in Africa, and that probably is going to be the relationship, that we can probably sustain 9 billion people. I disagree with Ian, I don't think we can sustain more, but it's all going to be to do with consumption, and that's really where we should be looking. But I want to answer the Blue Peter question, because I ended up on Newsnight, and I actually really rather wanted to be on Blue Peter. And I do a lot of these talks to schools, and I recently did one where I thought I was going to get sixth formers, and it was a sign-up talk, and we had over 100 students come in from age 12 to 16. And they were really interested, and there was one little boy in the audience. I'd split the audience up, and I said, I want you lot to think about living to 150, and I want you lot to think about living to 50. And remember that when you're, 12, 50 is actually ancient. But if that's the case, how are you going to plan and change your lives now? And there was this little 10-year-old who put his hand up and said, if I'm going to live to 150, I'm not going to start having kids till I'm 80.
Yes, sir. Somebody, yes, sir, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I recognise that none of the panel are politicians, but in view of the rapid change, is representative democracy with its short-term view capable of dealing with all of these changes?
Okay, next, please.
Mine actually relates to that, because I was going to ask Dr. Golding, you stressed that we have the power to shape our future. and also you touched in your opening remarks about the lack of effective global institutions. I wonder whether you've done any work which allows you to say anything optimistic about the chance of building effective global institutions and political structures.
There's that word again, optimistic. Yes? Somebody else?
Yes. Briefly, what role do you think Africa will have in development? How quickly will Africa develop? And also whether it's a given that, that water is going to become a traded commodity. How serious is water scarcity? And maybe also just a word on China. Is there a risk that we could be getting the China growth story wrong?
Okay, those are somewhat... Yes, one more, I think. Is there one going?
Yes, another community missing from the panel is the artistic community. To what extent have you engaged, poets, musicians, writers, actors, and so on, in order to bring your work to a wider audience?
Okay, so we've got democracy, we've got... yeah, go ahead.
Let me be very brief, so there's more time. This issue of democracy and thinking about the future is a really key challenge. And it's difficult to, in very intense democracies, to get people to think beyond yesterday's headlines, let alone 5, 10 years away. Whereas I've just come from China on Sunday, and you can have very deep conversations with the leadership about 5, 10, 20 years' time. Not only because they're planning that horizon, but because they're technocratic and it's a civil service, in a sense, run in many respects. A key is where the civil servants in the representative democracies have the capability to think long-term and act long-term beyond the politicians. And I think that capacity is absolutely central. But it's not only about, of course, the politics at that voting level, it's about politics on the street, it's about politics of mobilization, and that links to the second question on global institutions. What's so exciting about what's happening on climate change is that this is a bottom-up driven thing, through the web, through NGOs, through communities around, telling their politicians to wake up. And so this remarkable thing of political consensus driven by basically voter behavior in many countries. And I think that's exciting. The global institutions, I don't think there's a great deal of good news. The fact that the best institutional structure we have, the financial one, with the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Stability Forum, created only 10 years ago for global financial stability, proved to be absolutely blind to what happened. There's 20,000 brilliant economists with incredibly competitive entry into these institutions. Their task is global financial stability. No other global institution has near that capacity, and yet they were hopeless in predicting it, and they've been even more pathetic in dealing with it once it's arrived. So you have to ask yourself, what can these global institutions do if the best aren't capable? And I think that's going to require a very radical rethink about the whole nature of global governance and structure. Some good things have happened. The G8's morphed into the G20. I was on task forces that spent 3 months discussing how that might be possible. So there are silver linings in crisis, and one of them is rapid institutional change. The question is, has this financial crisis been big enough to create the necessary change? It's not only about the depth of the crisis, it's about the transmission belt and public and other voter behavior in creating new global institutions, a key issue. Just very briefly, Africa, water, China, passions of mine. Africa has an absolutely key role. Of course, I always revolt against the thinking about it as one place. It has the 5 countries in the world with highest growth rates. It also has the 5 countries in the world with the lowest growth rates. Phenomenal diversity across the 50 countries, and many, many things which are tremendously exciting for the future. So I think, yes, the potential is there, not least because of the demographic dividend that it will still enjoy while we are all aging. But there's lots of questions, obviously, that lie behind that. Water, absolutely key. I don't go with the concept that there are going to be water wars. There hasn't been one fought for over 1,000 years. But clearly, climate change, fresh water is going to be a major, major impediment. It's going to lead to many people dying of starvation across the world. And thinking about how to get water more effectively, desalination being one of them is important. China is a key to the future of the world. You cannot imagine the outcome of the 21st century without China playing a leading role. I don't think the growth prospects of China have been overdone. I think it is a phenomena that has never been to be seen before in human history. No country has ever grown before over a sustained period of time like it has over the last 30 years. I think that will continue for the next 20 years, and we can get into discussion as to why, and I think they'll take a responsible role as well. The question on artistic community in the 21st century school is a very interesting one, and we really have to as we begin to try and think about these ideas and engage with the public about raising awareness, engage with different communities about how you do this. We don't have the skills, we're just stupid professors that know what we're doing, but we need to really work out how you work with other communities. And there have been some people who've reached out to us, and it's been absolutely tremendous to offer to make films, plays, poetry, whatever. We don't actually know. We're struggling to work out what to do, but it's something we would welcome very, very much.
We can help you, sir, him and me. Anyone else before we go to more questions?
Can I just say something
yes, please
about
do.
The question of representative democracy? Because next week I'm giving a talk at the Sydney Opera House at a Dangerous Ideas Festival, where the title of the talk is Unfit for the Future. And the central idea is that we live in a society with massively enhanced technology. I mentioned bioweapons, and we also have problems that require global cooperation, like climate. We have a biology which is extremely limited in terms of its natural dispositions, and I talked about some of those. And we live in a liberal democracy, which is tolerant to different views of the good life and ways of living. And through history, I'm actually writing a book on this. Through history, if you look at the civilizations which survived, they were either small or totalitarian. And liberal democracy presents a number of problems, including the one that the first questioner asked, noted. But it also is hugely tolerant to different ways and different sets of values. And in order to deal with this problem of the threat that we pose to ourselves, either through global coordination problems or through the use of bioweapons or weapons of mass destruction, we may well have to do one of three things. One is to give up our commitment to liberal democracy, which is very unlikely to occur. The other is, which is what we're doing at the moment, increased surveillance of individuals and giving up significant amounts of our privacy. And the last one is to look at our own moral dispositions and our nature and attempt to influence that, not only through education and putting forward a set of values, but also through looking at the biological underpinnings of that moral behaviour. So we will face a crisis for liberal democracy. I don't think we'll give it up, but we may well have to move from complete liberal neutrality to a democracy that seeks to instil certain sets of values.
Thank you very much. Let's go with you, sir. You've been waiting a long time.
Hi. Three short questions. The first one is, I've read the book from the 21st Century School, the nice big yellow one. Really good at raising some of the issues that you alluded to this evening. Will there be a book follow-on showing or encouraging people what sort of processes and policies they need to implement over time to address some of these things? Number two, there's never ever been a rise of a great democracy without some sort of war. Will China have peaceful growth, or will we see a war? And the third one is directed at Sarah Harper. You mentioned the 70-year-old woman phoning and talking about her brothers. Was that Princess Anne talking about Charles?
Yes. Yes, I wondered if he was in the audience. Yes, thank you. Sir, I will come to you next, I promise. Just that gentleman has been waiting a long time and been standing.
It seems to me that the greatest issue is equality and eliminating inequality. But we are all bound towards, we're all selfish and greedy. As soon as there's a suggestion that the tax on upper tax band should increase, there's great protests everywhere. Somebody suggested putting a property tax on properties worth more than £1 million. It was a very small sum, and yet there were great protests about it. So what I would like to know, is there a possibility of putting in, getting us all loaded with genes for generosity and cooperativeness, and getting rid of the greed and selfishness genes? Thank you.
That's fantastic. Because don't forget, sir, gene is the word at the beginning of generosity. Sir.
Malcolm McCulloch very kindly showed us a lovely photograph of a Morgan life car, which I believe was run on a hydrogen cell. I just wonder if there's any view about the current opinion of all the car manufacturers that we will be driving hybrid electric cars in 25 years' time, which my understanding will not reduce the CO2 emissions.
Excellent. You, sir, next. And I wonder if you could take a slightly different... You two are so efficient. From now on, could you people who want to talk attract their attention? They can see you better than I, and we can move quicker. Thank you, sir. Go.
I work as a futurist, and most of the time I'm working with corporations or governments on long-term kind of strategy things. But the most interesting sort of and promising things you talk about, things like fertility decline, have to play out thanks to everyday decisions made by a lot of people over the course of a very long period. And so my question is this: most of the time, we engage the public through, let's say, writing books or in very episodic kinds of ways. And so, do you see ways in which we can help people better see the shadow of the future, the long-term consequences of decisions that they are making right now, that can help them nudge them in the kinds of positive directions in which they would like to go?
Thank you. Who's going to go?
Just very quickly, the book, The Meaning of the 21st Century, that Jim Martin wrote, it's not the 21st Century School. He did give us a very generous endowment. We are producing a whole range of publications, and please do look at our website, which was up there, to find more. But yes, there's constant, from all of us, that's what academics do. We produce lots and lots of books on a wide range of topics, and hopefully we're getting better at making it understandable, not just people in a very narrow clique. I'm not concerned if I was to rank the top 100 sort of issues of the future that China is going to be a destabilizing force or lead to war, and there's all sorts of reasons for it, but it's demonstrated over time, I think, a capacity to engage, to open up in a whole variety of areas, and now it is on the climate change side as well, which really are beginning to reflect where it's going to be in probably 20 years' time, which is the most powerful economy on Earth. So I don't see what it would gain from destabilizing the world. I'll leave Julian to answer inequality and genes, and Malcolm on Morgan Life, just on how we begin to understand the future and think about that. What we are doing in the 21st Century School is different in one respect to what others are doing with brilliant stem cell institutes or climate change groups and people working in the many different areas that we cover, is we're trying to join the stuff up. We are trying to think across in an interdisciplinary manner, and each of these teams in themselves is interdisciplinary. We think that that is a way of helping ourselves and helping policymakers and private sector leaders and others in society understanding the world as they see it. In other words, the problem or issue-focused way of trying to organize research and thinking. We need to get much better at distilling this. But it's not just us. This has got to be a global collective human effort to think, it's absolutely shocking to me. The rest of our lives, as we all know, will be in the future. We know the scale of the issues. And you think, how much time do societies, do institutions spend focusing on the future? And it's trivial. How much money do governments spend? There's a plea for more money for us and for many others. How much is spent on us? It's tiny, the investment in the future. And all of us, the media, universities, private sector, governments certainly need to invest much more in understanding the future and raising awareness and then making hard choices around many of these things.
Thank you. Next, please.
The genes for generosity. So Lord Martin Rees, the president of the Royal Society and one of the UK's greatest scientists, wrote a book called Our Final Century, where he gave humanity only a 50% chance of making it through this century. And Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, a couple of years ago ran a poll on the internet where he asked people what did they think was the greatest threat to humanity in this century. And at the end of the poll, a newspaper asked him for his own view of that threat and what should be done about it. And he said, well, humanity still faces a threat from asteroid strikes, but it's incredibly small. The threat of nuclear holocaust is still real. We now face a threat from climate change. We also face threats from infectious diseases, but now both natural and man-made. And he didn't mention nanotechnology, but that's another one that's mentioned. And he said that, of course, the world, or Earth, will not continue to exist forever. At some point, our future lies in space. But in order to realise that possibility, we have to live for at least 100 years because it will take us that time before we can start to realistically inhabit space. So he said this is our crucial century. And if we're to survive this century, we should perhaps genetically engineer ourselves to be wiser and less aggressive. So what many people thought was funny about engineering generosity and reducing greed may well be the kind of thing that we need to survive as a species. So I think my friend that referred to me as Dr. Strangelove before is gone, but at least I have good bedfellows in Stephen Hawking.
I know where he lives. Okay, we have two. Well done. Thank you very much. There's two speakers.
Malcolm on hydrogen.
I'm so sorry. You're going too fast.
Just a quick one on the future of what vehicles are going to be looking like. I think you're going to see an ecosystem of different types of vehicles going around, hybrid being one of them, especially in the next 5 years or so. You'll also start to seeing a lot of battery vehicles coming through, and in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll start to seeing hydrogen vehicles. I think you'll see an interesting mix of and diversity of what the energy carriers are going to be in the transport sector.
Thank you very much, and thank you for prompting me there. Two speakers from up on the top, and I think there's a gentleman there down who wants to speak as well. Please go ahead.
This is a question for all four members of the panel. As you've excelled through your careers and as you've got older, you must have become more aware of the dangers in terms of climate change. What personal things or changes have you made to your lifestyles to reduce your impact, specifically on carbon and also on the use of non-cyclical resources? I ask this not just to put you on the spot, although that is quite fun, but also because I wonder if the explosion in information that you discussed could be used to communicate the risks around climate change to everybody in the world, and if at what point in their lives they may make changes. So at what point did you make those changes?
Next, please.
I work for an MBA magazine called Business Because, and my question is, do you think there should be a more formalized effort by the business schools around the world to be actively debating these issues with their MBAs in terms of how to be running the world in 2050, given that these people may be leading the institutions and businesses that are organizing the world?
Right, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, hi, I'm one of those Britain's Got Talent hippies. I'm a TED Fellow. And I've been enjoying the debate, by the way, and I've got a specific question for Malcolm, which is we hear a lot about energy conservation, alternative energy sources, and recyclables. I'm very interested in predictions based on carbon sequestration, the other kind of part of the equation to addressing the carbon dioxide problem.
Please go ahead in your order. Thank you.
Okay. Just very briefly, I think the question on climate change is really crucial, because I'd be the first to admit that although I know all the evidence, my behavior has not changed in the way that fundamentally it has to be. I don't have a car, I have 3 bicycles and a kayak, but I fly too much and my house is leaky, and I'm probably just in my office emitting 2 tons of carbon per year. So if we add up our carbon footprints, and we know we've got to get from at least 10, and I assume I'm over that, down to 2, it's going to require radical personal choices and change. And the fact that I know the evidence and I'm not changing it is embarrassing, but it's actually, I think, the worry. We really have to move from understanding the theory to transforming to our own lives. And how we do that, what incentive structures there are around it, is absolutely crucial. Just the question on the MBA. There's a sense in which management theory is the part of the problem for systemic risk. It's the very short supply chains. It's the removal of all resilience through stocks. It's the valuing of all assets and needing them to sweat, which has led to these very taut relationships in globalization and the very rapid transmissions of shocks. And so what's important as we think about, of course, educating the business leadership of the future, is how do we value risk? How do we value this long tail that's wagging more aggressively on the risk curves, and ensure that we begin to think that it's not just about ensuring that the banks use up every cent of their capital or penny of their capital in a productive way, that some buffers in manufacturing, some buffers in service supplies, and resilience in systems, redundancies, a terrible word, needs to come back as a concept in management speak, as a means of ensuring that we can get through many of these systemic shocks that globalization is going to bring much more rapidly to many more of us. So it's absolutely crucial we engage with management theory, with MBAs, but I think we also need to think rather deeply about some of our assumptions regarding the drives, and not least the consumer drives that we've had.
Go ahead, please.
Right, so I'm slightly lucky in terms of the lifestyle that I'm leading, that over this last year, I've taken steps to decrease my carbon footprint down to 30% of what it was last year. That's primarily because I've seen how bad the figures are coming through. And it's just, it scared me witless because of my 2-year-old son. I know that he's going to be living in a very difficult world, and I don't want him to be accusing me of living the reckless lifestyle. In terms of carbon sequestration, there's one big problem with carbon sequestration which not many people talk about, and that means that for every 4 units of energy that you get out of a coal-fired power station, you need one unit of energy to actually do the carbon sequestration. That's just to get the carbon out of the system, and therefore it's extremely energy intensive, and that's very costly. And therefore, I think he's going to run into difficulties in the future. And I think that's going to be one of the real problems with carbon sequestration in the long term.
I promised that gentleman there. Could you please go to that gentleman next after this? Yes, go ahead, please. Can you see?
Our discussion title is The World in 2050. We have spoken for a long time about one species alone. This planet has millions of species. Does the panel see any future for biodiversity?
Yes, can you see her? Please go ahead, sir, and then you, sir. Thank you.
I would just like to say, yes, what work are you doing on protecting the fabric of nature, which has no votes? All the species in the world, I mean, the United States spends $8 million a year on global biodiversity. We spend £7 million a year. There are no votes in it. What is the mechanism by which we can actually protect the fabric of the planet? What work has been done on that?
Excellent. You, sir?
We've had a wonderful demonstration of rationality from the panel, and we've touched on issues of politics and governance, generosity. It seems to me a much more fundamental problem is how you actually get people to face up to this kind of analysis and indeed to face up to truth. We've had an alarming demonstration in the United States in the past few months of the willingness of a substantial proportion of that population to ignore truth, to ignore reality. And behind that there's another issue which I hesitate to mention, but it's a subject you haven't even touched upon, and that is religion. Could you please comment, any of you who's willing to do so, on any of these issues?
Right, thank you. And you?
It's a question for Professor Julian. It's following what you said, Jack, about one of the forthcoming events is going to be about, I think you talked about the Catholic Church. It's considering, do you think that there might be a rise or a decrease of religion, or say to be less contagious, rise of spirituality, talking about ethics?
I think that's going to be it. So if there's anyone got a burning question, please put your hands up now. Hand up now. Let's see. Yes. Okay, one burning question. Forgive me. 2. And that's going to be it. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. Remember I said about the blog and the forum. They get their minute. You get your bite of the cherry. Go ahead, please.
This is quite a selfish question. With Africa and China doing so well, what is Britain's place in the world in 2050?
Lovely. And next one, please.
I work for the Institute for Philanthropy. We advise wealthy donors on giving money away to certain causes. To what extent do you think the wealthy donors of the world have a role to play in the new reality?
Okay, so can I ask you panelists, because we have 4 minutes left, remember we're going to sum up and then we're going to say goodbye, and that's it.
So what are we doing about rationality? Well, in fact, we have a program looking at using functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is a new technology which studies how the brain works. And we've already published some important papers on the differences between people's moral judgments. Why are some people prepared to make so-called utilitarian judgments, to sacrifice some people for the greater good, whereas others aren't? Why is it that we differ in the ways in which we make different judgments, and why is it that we don't face the truth? So we are at the beginning of that. The question about religion, very important. Identical twin studies that have shown that religiosity has a significant genetic contribution. We may well understand how we can manipulate religiosity one way or another. My own view is that it's incredibly important that we not just educate our business leaders, which is incredibly important, but our children on how to think ethically in not just a religious way, where our whole tradition has been in terms of Judeo-Christianity, but in a secular way, and how to think ethically about problems like how we should divide new technology, how we should deal with the environment. So one of the great challenges is to develop secular modes of ethical education. And the question about artists, some of the best science fiction films like the 6 Day Boys from Brazil, are great expositions of some of the ethical issues in this.
Excellent. Thank you. Sarah.
Just really to summarise by drawing up on what Julian said, a lot of this is all about raising public awareness. There are so much myths out there. The internet is out there generating false information. It isn't just that the scientists can't agree, that's true, but we need far more public awareness of science for children, for business communities, for politicians. The amount of people who are still saying overpopulation is a massive problem, we've got to bring down fertility. It's complete rubbish, but those kind of myths are still out there in my world, and I'm sure they're out there in everyone's world. So it's things like this where you have the opportunity to share real science with interested people and start getting rid of some of those myths.
Thank you.
I think, just to summarise, one of the key problems that we have as humanity is that we find the optimal solution and then maximise it to death. And one of the outcomes of that is things like monocultures, which then lead to the decrease in biodiversity. And I'm hoping that in this coming century that we'll learn that that's a wrong paradigm.
Thank you very much. To sum up, Ian.
Thank you. Just on biodiversity, I think you're absolutely right. We neglected that in this. We've actually, I'm delighted to say, in the last week, just got full agreement on the creation of an Institute of Biodiversity in the school. So we're looking for a chair for that, if anyone knows anyone that wants to lead it, and we'll get all the Oxford qualifications under their belt. Please apply to me immediately. So it's because we believe fundamentally that we need to ensure much better balance and understanding of many of these things, which could lead, of course, to all sorts of tipping points. We don't know, but it's absolutely key. I think others have spoken to the point on religion. I would emphasize that there's a number of potentially destabilizing forces, and that's one of those is religious fundamentalism. But actually, you don't have to be a religious fundamentalist to want to blow up the world. A lot of crazy people out there with all sorts of other motives, like their mother never loved them or whatever else. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to prevent the power that individuals have for the first time in the history of humanity to blow a large part of the planet up, and the need to create inclusive globalization. It's absolutely crucial that everyone feels that need, and it's particularly those with power. Where will the UK be in 2050? I think it's about thought leadership. If the UK can get itself behind a realization that actually what the future really is about is ideas and the generation and nurturing of ideas, being thought leaders, being policy leaders, I think that's a tremendous opportunity. And finally, I can't but help taking the bait on philanthropy. Absolutely essential. Give it to us. Give it. We have a matching scheme up at the moment of $50 million that Jim Martin will match if we can get that by March the 10th. But yes, it's absolutely crucial. Wealthy people around the world need to understand that their wealth is not their own and that their future depends on a shared prosperity. And that is, of course, a vital dimension of philanthropy. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really sorry we didn't have more time. Please come and engage with us through our website and elsewhere.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Well, you've all heard that we're not going to die, and yet we're all going to be killed. We have a capacity to cooperate. Can you have your kayak and heat it? Human beings will light up the world. We have the capacity to cooperate, and we can shape the future. I want to thank the sponsors. I want to thank the James Martin 21st Century School at the University of Oxford and Intelligence Squared, to thank our panel, and ladies and gentlemen, to you, well done you for coming. Good night.